Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Kelley. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
And a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human.
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture.
And what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion. Hey, Kelley.
Hey, Erin.
What's going on?
You know what? It is a beautiful spring day.
Yeah, and you just retired.
I just retired. I have like 2 hours left.
Oh my gosh.
It's pretty amazing.
That's pretty exciting.
It is.
Yeah.
It is exciting. And I just moved into a new house. I just got a new puppy because I just figured, why not just explode my life in all the ways? Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. It's a new chapters all around.
Yeah, it is. And it's, fun. It's exciting.
Yeah.
It's a very Seven thing to do.
Yeah. It's so true.
Just do it all. Change it all. We love change. We love, yeah. So, how are you doing?
Good. We lost a pet. So our cat died. I know.
Sweet Georgia.
Yeah, she died this week.
How old is she?
We're not totally sure because Lauren got her when she was an adult cat, and they basically, anytime you adopt an adult cat, they just say they're two.
Oh,
it doesn't.
Okay.
They're all two.
they're all two. It could have been 7.
Yeah. So we don't know. We think at least like 16-ish, maybe.
Wow.
So, and she's
How
been.
many years did Lauren have her?
I mean, she's had her, during all of residency and some of med school, and I mean, for like 14 years or
Wow.
something. So, yeah. Which is, I mean, for her is obviously like that's a whole like Georgia has been the constant in her life through like all of these big major life changes and all the different houses. We've been in 3 different houses, and so it was definitely sad. Elaine totally did not get what was going on.
Yeah.
She kept being like, "Is Georgia going to the vet? What's happening?" I know. So, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those, things that just remind you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about a couple of books that we've been reading, and one of the books that I've been reading is the Anxious Generation, and so much of the book really calls to my attention like all of the things that consume our attention that are just meaningless.
Yeah.
And I often talk about like Lauren's job is sort of like anti-social media in a way.
Yeah.
Because it can be so serious that it kind of like immediately jars you out of
The superficial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this morning she was sending me a message because she was at work, and this woman she'd come in that she was treating she was being treated for like a potential fluid exchange, but this woman had witnessed a very tragic car accident and like was helping give CPR to like this 12-year-old who like their face was smashed in, and then some of the other people in the car died. I mean, while she was, so you're just like, Lauren was like, nothing else matters. Like what else, there's just like, so it's just, and I'm grateful that I have that kind of like reality check all the time, because it's so easy for us to get carried away with things and, just about caring about things that don't matter. They really don't matter.
Yep.
So it's been a bit of a week like that, like, where I just kind of being confronted with like what actually matters in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that is just such a good reminder, and such a good thing to keep checking in on. Yeah, what do I care about right now? Yeah, and do I care about the right things?
Right, and what is the thing I keep thinking about too is it's like what is real?
Yeah,
what is my reality right now.
Yep.
So one of the things that Jonathan Haidt talks about in this book, The Anxious Generation, and to kind of give you like a high level like overview of what the book is really talking about how a phone-based childhood rather than a play-based childhood really has transformed Gen Z, or, and all of us really like that. I mean, you can see how the effects that are so acute in Gen Z, but like that we're all sort of affected by this. But one of the things that he talks about is like that human beings have bodies, that we are embodied.
Yep.
And that this is one of the reasons that a play-based childhood can never really be replaced by a phone-based childhood, because you're not physically, like your body is not actually learning anything in this virtual world. And so that's something that it's been in my consciousness lately is I was at the park with Elaine, and she's like trying to do the monkey bars, and then I was trying to do the monkey bars, and you're like, this is what is real.
Yeah.
Like this moment that I am existing in is what is real.
Yes.
And everything else is noise.
Yeah. That's so interesting. You sent me a chapter that I think we'll probably talk about today too, that I read that, where he talks about embodiment as one of the like 6 spiritual practices.
Yeah.
And that really struck me. I wrote an essay for this class I was taking this last year on rituals and creating sacred space, and like what does that look like? And I talk a lot about kind of the things that I would do in theater class with kids, and like, that's an embodied practice. Kids are usually the games we would play or the exercises we would do, they are bodies in space, right? And I told a story about when I was in college, the first theater space that we had in college was the basement of this dorm. And so it was like a terrible space to do theater, right?
Yeah.
It was like low ceilings. There was all these, poles everywhere. So there was, not great sight lines. But my teacher would say, that was actually a really great space because it wasn't perfect. And so they did really dangerous theater. But then when they got the really good space and they actually finally built a real theater. And I love this. I love this story. Everybody in the department went over to the old space and they placed their hands on the walls of the old space. And they asked like the spirit of all of the energy and all the things that had been done in that space to kind of, enter their hands. Yeah. And then they sang and like had their hands raised. They walked from the old space to the new space. And then they put their hands on the walls in the new space and they brought them over. And I love that story because it's like we are embodied creatures. Yeah. Right. And there's something like we're created that way for a reason to be like we're 3-dimensional and there's gravity, right? Yeah. So we're connected to space and we're connected to each other. Yeah. And I just find that
I love that. I love that. So the story that Haidt opens the book up with is basically like, if you sent your kid to Mars. And he's like, because we live on Earth. And I think that is I was like, oh, wow. And he was kind of talking about, if someone said like, well, we're going to send your kid to Mars. And you're like, well, I have all these questions. Like, is it okay for my kid to be like raised on Mars? Like, are there going to be health consequences? Like you would have questions, right? And instead we've sort of just like allowed these devices that have actually really dramatically changed our cognition and the way that we connect with each other and the way we just move through our lives. Like it consumes an incredible amount of people's time. And anything that we're doing habitually and spending a lot of time on is creating pathways in the brain, right? And so, but he kind of talks about like, or what was one of the parallels that he used? He was like, so if you're he was like in the virtual world, so the play-based childhood, when you're out playing with friends and you have a mistake, right? Like, or there's an argument or you have a conflict. You work that out like in real time with others, right? And he's like, but online, any mistake can become a viral thing, and it can be like merciless, right?
Right.
And he's like, not that he's like, Mars is probably more dangerous than the internet or the phone-based childhood.
Maybe.
But he's like, the idea that if you were on Mars and you fall and you crack your face mask, like that mistake, it has a lot more risk, right? And it's like that the same, like, as embodied humans who make mistakes, and that's how we learn. We need to be able to like make those mistakes and learn those things in an environment that doesn't have consequences that like follow us forever or that feel like they do.
Yep.
And how detrimental that is to like development and risk taking.
Well, and that, that leads me to kind of think about the idea of like there's a reason our memories fade.
Yeah, that our memories are bad, like actually really bad.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Because also if we remembered, like we live in that kind of emotion and that shame, right?
Yeah.
So shame fades, memories fade for a reason, so we can move on.
Yeah.
But on the internet, you don't forget.
Yeah.
It's always there.
I know. Well, so that comment about memory, I was just listening to an interview, and I don't remember the guy's name, but he wrote a book about memory, and he was posing this question, which I oddly had never really thought about, but he was just like, "What is memory for? What is the purpose of it?" Because we mostly, when we think, I think often when we think about memory, we think of it as, well, this is like a movie reel of my past life, right?
Yeah.
And he's like, it's not that. And if we really think about it for a second, we know that that's not what it is, right? But so what is it doing? It's trying to serve you in the present.
Yeah.
And so that's why memory, you change your memories or you conflate them or you add details. And he was talking about a relationship that he had, and he was like, and it ended badly. And so now I go back and I look at, when I have memories of that relationship, I sort of characterize everything in this negative light, even though like it actually probably wasn't like that, but that's just the way that to serve me in the present, that's the way that I've like colored these memories, you know? And I thought that was is an interesting insight. And it's like, okay, so to just consider like, well, why do I remember something this way? You know, because that's what I've tried to learn is like to always try to question myself.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what is it trying to serve?
Yeah.
What is my mind trying to serve for me in the present?
Yeah. Well, and in our political climate too, like the idea of like conservative nostalgia, right? Like people are really like cling to the past, and they have this idealized vision of what it is. Yeah. And it's really just, it's not that.
I think that's human nature. I think human nature tends to look more fondly at like things in the past, and they're more fearful of what the future is. Yeah. And I do sort of one of the things, and it's interesting because obviously there's pushback to Jonathan Haidt's work, and like there was to Jean Twenge 5 or 6 years ago when she wrote the iGen book, which was like the first one that was like, hey guys, I study generations for a living and something's up.
Yeah, right. Something's happening.
And I think we might want to pay attention to it. Yeah, and anyway, she turned out to be totally, totally right. But, he's often sort of like trying to, counter arguments where people are like, oh, this is just another moral panic of like, that TV or video games or whatever. Right. And he was like, here's the thing that he was talking about the other day, which I thought was interesting. It was like, there are, and I know a lot of young people that are involved in these organizations. He's like, there's an unbelievable number of members of Gen Z that are like in their, mid 20s that are organizing around making technology companies accountable for the products that they make. And he's like, it's not like you had like these movements of people saying like, of the users of the video games saying like, these are bad and we should ban them. But like, he's like, you have this huge movement of young people who are like, I know that these devices are manipulating me. Like
Yes.
that they are not good for my mental health. And there's organizations all over Europe and the United States. So he, like this last piece that he wrote, profiled like 10 young people who are out like trying to create organizations to help other youth, because they either went through things on their own or witnessed that in other people in their generation. So I was like, that's an interesting, I mean, I obviously don't agree with the idea that this is just another moral panic. I think we all really, if we want to be reflective, can see like the change and that it's not positive. But
Yeah. I mean, like if you sit down and watch television for like 3 days straight, you're going to be sad too. Like if I spend a whole day in front of Netflix, like, like by the end of the day, I'm like, like you just feel like you ate sugar all day or something.
Right. And that's what he's saying. He's like, it's not phones specifically. Like he's like, these were not problems when you had flip phones or mobile phones that didn't have the internet on them, where you took the internet with you everywhere you went.
Yes.
And that's the difference. Like if you carried your TV around with you everywhere you went, and you spent like sometimes, I think the data was like, it's 8 hours a day that these young people were spending on social media.
If you're like, oh, I'm waiting in line at the post office, let's keep watching Bridgerton.
Yeah.
Like that's not what people are doing. I mean, maybe some people are.
Some people might. It's a good show.
It is a good show. Oh, we should have an episode about Bridgerton.
I haven't actually finished it, but I did.
Oh,
I
this
watched
season.
Is it good?
Oh, for us fat girls, it is a good season. Yep. Sex positive for fat girls. I love it. So okay, I'm going to tell you one more story, and then I want you to keep talking about this. So another of this embodied, youth, and I might have mentioned this at some other point, but I remember. So this one exercise I did with kids, I do a lot of like walking around the room and movement stuff. So I had kids walking around the room, and I just give them the cue. I say, okay, whatever you're doing right now as you're walking around the room, I just want you to keep yourself engaged. Like keep yourself interested and curious.
Yeah.
So the cue being, and in, for 24 years or 25 years, like most classes, they start, walking funny or walking in a circle in a different way or walking slower. Like they start making choices, right, to keep themselves interested. Well, this one time I did it, and I gave the same cue, and half the kids pulled their phones out of their pockets. So for them, to be interested meant to take themselves out of their bodies and put themselves in this the space of Mars.
In Mars.
To actually leave, leave their bodies.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. No.
Yeah. That's not what we were going for. Isn't that interesting too? Like these, I think that especially, where we see these trends so acutely are in spaces where, if you're a parent of a teen, you're going to see these effects. If you're a teacher of teenagers, you're going to see these effects. Lauren in the emergency room, because she used to work both like in the pediatric and the adult emergency room. She was like, when I first started, as a medical student and resident, she was like, you almost never saw, like it was like once a month that you would get a young person in who had like was trying to kill themselves. And she's like, now it's every day. And it's just like clear, like distinctions of like, this is just different. Something is different, you know? And she was like, and also just the number of, patients that are just constantly on their phones the whole time that you're like in there trying to talk to them, or, it's like, I don't think you're really that sick, or, if you're paying more attention to your phone than me, But yeah, I mean, so those sorts of like, and that was one thing that I noticed obviously in education was like, oh my gosh, all these students that I would have would be hospitalized for and be out for weeks, or, having panic attacks at school. I'm like, what is going on? It just was a bizarre shift.
Yeah. For me, because I did these, I feel like I had a really interesting data set because I did these same exercises every year.
Yeah.
for years. And so watching how kids would, collaborate, it took kids before, like there would be times when I would give kids in like this assignment and they would talk for maybe 2 minutes and then they'd get up on their feet and they'd start working on it. They'd start doing it. By the end, the end of my career, I would give them the same assignment. And if they got up for 2 minutes on their feet, for like, say, the 20 minutes that they had, they would spend 18 minutes talking about it and 2 minutes.
Embodied. That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good anecdote. Well, so that kind of, all of this, so the chapter in particular that I wanted to talk about on the show was chapter 8 of the book. So it's he's kind of already laid the case, the groundwork for all of the social science and all of the data around mental health outcomes and like how this is affecting us. But he talks about like the opening of the chapter 8. It's called Spiritual Elevation and Degradation. And he was like, I just want to write less as a social scientist and more as a fellow human being who's felt overwhelmed personally and perpetually since around 2014. And he brings in all of these great spiritual traditions. And I think Jonathan Haidt, interestingly, as an atheist, writes a lot about religion. He's a moral psychologist. So he's very interested in how like religious influences, and practices affect people's lives.
Yeah.
So one of the things that he brings up in this chapter that was a phrase that I hadn't heard before, but it was the God-shaped hole.
Yeah.
And he says, soon before his death in 1662, the French philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote a paragraph often paraphrased as, there is a God-shaped hole in every human heart. I believe he was right. In The Righteous Mind, which is also a really good book, I think The Righteous Mind is actually maybe his best book, but they're all good. I drew on the writings of Charles Darwin and the biologist David Sloan Wilson to explain how natural selection might have carved that hole, that humanity went through a long period of what is known multi-level selection in which groups competed with groups, while at the same time individuals competed with individuals within each group. The most cohesive groups won, and humans evolved, both biologically and cultural evolution, and adaptation that made their groups even more cohesive. Religiosity, including both the fear and the love of gods. So it was like included in this cohesion. And so that was a really striking. I'd heard him talk about this before when he wrote about it in The Righteous Mind, and this idea of like multi-level selection, and that you're selecting for behaviors that in human beings that would make for good group cooperation.
Right.
But this idea, this God-shaped hole, and what I was taking from it is like there's this strong desire in all of us to be connected to something that is bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And he talks about this at the very beginning of this chapter of like that most of us, and this is because we have to meet just our needs on a day-to-day basis, right? Sort of exist at this level that's like more egocentric, where you're thinking about yourself, your status, you're thinking about like, how much money I have, what do other people think of me, like that you're in this state a lot. And then, but what religion can do, and other things too. So he's talking about sports or other activities
nature.
Being in nature, anything that brings you out of yourself, calls you to a higher state is a kind of religion in a way, or filling that God-shaped hole.
Yeah. I think, and he references Dr. Keltner, where we talked about in our first episodes, and that the default system, right? That ego-driven, like big self.
Yep.
And that these things that bring you out of that. And he had like that graph that he puts at the beginning of this chapter, right? Yeah. The things that kind of lift us up, or that kind of horizontal, or the that diagonal line.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, it can either bring us up kind of closer to the divine or bring us down to like the degradation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that reminded. So there's a priest that has written a lot of books who I think I find really, really helpful. His writing is Father Ronald Rolheiser, and he's written about like the nature of spirituality. And one of the things that he said very similar to this. Everybody is spiritual, like the same. Like we're all physical, we're all emotional, we're all spiritual, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not up for debate, really. And like I think he would agree. I think Haidt would agree. He said, but the nature of kind of how we fill that quote God-shaped hole, right, is our spirituality, and it can either be integrated or they can be disintegrating. So you can fill that God-shaped hole with things that are bigger than you, that are uplifting, that are generative, you know, whether that's you know, volunteerism, whether that's sports, whether that's a religious practice. But you fill it with things that are generative, or you can fill it with things that are degenerative, like scrolling on a phone, like some kinds of addictions, you know, or really any kind of addiction, which is also what the phone, right, does. Or just things that are, you know, superficial and meaningless. So when he speaks, I think, to that idea. So Haidt does, I think, in this chapter, and it reminded me a lot of that.
Well, I almost want to take the a step further when he's talking about like degradation, and he gets into this at the end of the chapter. There's also a piece that I just recently read. And I'm forgetting the title, but the author, her name is Freya India. And she was making the point that social media, it doesn't, it's not that it's bad just because we spend so much time in social comparison. It's that the act of being in social comparison all the time actually makes us crueler people. And I was like, whoa. I mean, it's true. And so he kind of talks about this in some of the like ways to kind of live in a more spiritual, like where you're filling that God-shaped hole with something that is more humane. But he's talking about like being slow to anger and quick to forgiveness, and how that's not really how our culture exists anymore. That social media is the opposite of that.
It's reactive.
Yeah,
absolutely. I love what he writes at the beginning of that chapter when he says he's an atheist. He says he's an atheist. He said he's like, I think I should mention here that I am an atheist, but I often need to draw wisdom from religious wisdom traditions.
In order to explain, like to have language to
explain it. I just find incredible and just awesome, because I mean, I think science needs spirituality, and I think spirituality needs science. And when they can support each other, I feel like that's like the sweet spot.
Yeah. And then, so kind of thinking about, you know, Haidt's work with someone like Dr. Keltner, who they're both trying to kind of weave in both. How do we see like religious practices? How do we see spirituality sort of also from a social science lens, and how do we explain that in some way? There was a passage from Awe from the 2023 book that was written by Dr. Keltner, which we talked about in a very early episode. But he writes this, and this kind of goes back to the piece I was referencing from Freya India. So he writes, as our default self vanishes, so that ego self, right? Other studies have shown awe shifts us from competitive dog-eat-dog mindset to perceive that we are a part of networks of more interdependent, collaborating individuals.
Yeah.
We sense that we are a part of a chapter in the history of a family, a community, a culture, an ecosystem. And that's, and Haidt kind of draws this out just like in our embodied interactions with other people about how breaking bread with someone else and not just having dinner at a restaurant, but like sharing from the same plates,
Yeah.
you know, or the serving from the same dishes, that those embodied in-person experiences build trust.
Yeah.
And that when you then leave those places, you feel closer to the people that you interacted with, even, you know, that you get to carry that with you.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. And you know, this leads us right back to also to the David Brooks book, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we are part of an interconnected ecosystem, you know, and that our connectedness matters.
Yeah.
And not only matters, but really defines us.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Like, I feel like, you know, I was thinking about this, you know, at the last day, our last faculty meeting, when I'm like, goodbye, everybody, you know, and I'm like, what am I going to, you know, what little words do I want to drop?
What are you gonna say?
Right.
Yeah.
And I just feel like bringing these 3 books, like bringing awe, bringing How to Know a Person, and bringing The Anxious Mind, and being like, this, like, this is what you all need. Like, this is what we all need. This is what these kids need.
Yeah.
I mean, it just like, because like, and there's science, and the science is what's important. Like, kids need to know the science.
Yes, they need to understand
so that they can
why.
Understand. Yeah, they need the why.
Well, and this makes me think about, so like, I like this interconnected ecosystem idea. When I sit here for a second, there's the book, The Overstory, where like all of the trees are connected in this ecosystem, and there's like a shared neural network. And then on some level, right, you're kind of like, it's probably, we're all the same, right, on some level. But then we think about what an individual, like this tiny rectangular device that is designed to commodify your attention by giving you something that is so highly individualistic and individually curated.
Yes.
And it's like, you know, just, it's so far from that interconnected ecosystem. And the interconnected ecosystem also requires, just like he's sort of talking about, that being slow to anger and quick to forgiveness. In order to exist,
you need to adapt.
Yes. And be able to like have, you know, just
be pliant and willing to move and, you know, grow and give space and take space and and bring your differences, right? And that idea of this curated space just for you. Where it's just so comfortable that nobody's asked to really move or adapt.
To be uncomfortable. So that's one of the big topics in the book he talks about is anti-fragility, which is a term that was first came, Nassim Taleb, I believe is the author's name, but he's talking about so there's objects that are fragile, like a wine glass. I knock it off the table, it's going to shatter. And then there are objects that are like a plastic cup. I can knock it off and it's not going to shatter. It's not, nothing really has happened to it at all. But then there are things, and he's like, it's mostly like living things and organizations or ecosystems that are anti-fragile, meaning that they actually become stronger with like tension, pressure, difficulty. And so one of the examples that he gives in the book is that, and this was in the Taleb book, where these researchers were trying to basically build like an ecosystem in a bubble, and they planted all these trees, and then the trees would grow and then they just fall over, and they're like, I wonder why. And it's like, it turns out the trees needed wind, because the wind, that resistance, caused their roots to get deeper and stronger so that they could resist higher winds later on, right? And so just an example of like something that is anti-fragile, that gets stronger with pressure over time, right? And so he's like, this is how human beings actually are.
Yeah.
Like, is that we have to have sort of these experiences, and especially embodied experiences,
Yep.
where we are challenged
Mm-hmm.
and have difficulty and can like move through it, and then be able to be like, okay, I was able to handle that challenge. But instead, we've sort of created this culture of safetyism,
Yep.
where parents are super overprotective, and then also just like everything about the environment is sort of telling them that I'm supposed to be like, I have to feel comfortable all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't feel comfortable all the time, then like that's a problem,
Yeah.
right? And it's like, no, that's not how anything works, actually.
Right. That's that anti-fragility is pretty genius.
Yeah.
The book that I was recommending is this book by Robin Wall Kimmerer that Belden referenced in when he talked to us, and I just read it for a class this last semester. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's very similar to this chapter.
Yeah.
And we'll I don't think we're done talking about this chapter,
Yeah.
but she is an indigenous scientist, and so the book is about exactly this, about the links between science and indigenous wisdom. And so kind of how they support each other, and how it's not even so much that it's like there's science and then there's like the wisdom traditions. It's that, and those are two different ways of knowing. It's that when we connect them, and when we kind of let them kind of play off each other, and that it's a new way of knowing.
Yeah.
That the science can tell us the what and maybe the how, but that the wisdom traditions are what teach us kind of the why.
Yeah.
And the what for, maybe.
It's interesting that you say that, and also kind of in reference to this chapter, but also in the earlier in the book, one of the things that Haidt is sort of saying, he feels like that this generation, this culture has sort of accepted, or has sort of like has gone away from all of the wisdom traditions.
Yeah.
Essentially, he's like the fundamental wisdom traditions, like we've adopted sort of a new ethos that is counter to what these wisdom traditions are. And so one of those being like, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker.
Yeah.
And life is a battle between good and evil people. And like all these sort of like habits of mind that are bad for like, a communal ecosystem.
Yeah.
But also just like individually not healthy for our own kind of mental habits as well.
Yeah.
So, but he really leans hard on, he's like, this is the wisdom that has been curated for over thousands of years.
Yeah.
It's like, what is true to humanity? And we've like in a decade kind of destroyed all of it.
Yeah, and just been like, we're just gonna bifurcate this off and just forget it.
Yeah.
Like this is what unthinking people, and I love the fact that that you don't necessarily have to have, you don't necessarily have to believe. You can take it as myth.
Yeah.
And you can still believe and you can believe that, because, and I love this idea that myth isn't necessarily true, but it's also more than true.
Yeah.
And it's so you don't have to necessarily believe in God to understand some of these religious wisdom traditions, or to pull, to pull things that would be helpful for your life, because it's still more than true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that sound weird?
No, I think I'm following you. He's referencing too in here all kinds of like ancient wisdom tradition. So he's touching on Stoicism and the Tao Te Ching and like
Buddhism
and
that are
all
not like theistic traditions.
Yeah. Which makes me want to go back and revisit the Tao Te Ching because I haven't read that in a really long time. So one of the passages in the book he's referencing the Tao Te Ching, and he says lists the ideas that ideas of right and wrong are a bedevilment. And he says, in my 35 years of studying moral psychology, I have come to see this as one of humanity's greatest problems. We are too quick to anger and too slow to forgive. And we are also hypocrites who judge others harshly while automatically justifying our own bad behavior. And then he brings in the Sermon on the Mount, and he's like, do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you will give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get.
Yeah. I mean, pretty smart stuff.
Oh, it's
all of it, right?
It's brilliant. And then this one's I remember this from my upbringing too. It says, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?"
Yeah,
it's brilliant.
Yeah. And that it's that comparison too, right?
Yeah. There was one passage that I did want to share, which was, this is actually from How to Know a Person. And it's when David Brooks was writing, he's sharing a passage from Leo Tolstoy. And as I was reading The Anxious Generation and this chapter in particular, and sort of some of these, like the wisdom traditions that he's like to draw on, and how to think about humanity, like how to think about yourself, but also how to think about other people, and to sort of like to take this more gentle and open posture with others. So this is the passage. So, one of the commonest and most generally accepted delusions is that every man can be qualified in some particular way, said to be kind, wicked, stupid, energetic, apathetic, and so on. People are not like that. We may say of a man that he is more often kind than cruel, more often wise than stupid, more often energetic than apathetic, or vice versa. But it could never be true to say of one man that he is kind or wise, or of another that he is wicked or stupid. We are always classifying mankind in this way, and it is wrong. Human beings are like rivers. The water is one and the same in all of them, but every river is narrow in some places, flows swifter in others. Here it is broad, there still, or clear, or cold, or muddy, or warm. It is the same with men. Every man bears within him the germs of every human quality, and now manifests one, now another, and frequently he is quite unlike himself, while still remaining the same man.
Yeah. A call to humility.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, do we need some of that?
I know.
I hear that, and I kind of look at our world right now, and I know that Haidt offers like here are some things. Like I think that's what David Brooks is trying to do.
Yeah,
He's trying
here
to
are some
say,
solutions.
like, here are some ways to kind of move into that. I mean, I feel like all of these books that we've been talking about this year are books that are really tapping into this need, and trying to offer a solution. And these are people who probably have, well, at least Brooks, this wasn't something that he was interested in before. Like this is the zeitgeist right now.
Yeah,
right? This is what we need. So what does Haidt suggest? Like, what are some of the things?
Yeah, I mean, so he gets pretty practical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, towards the end, and I mean, his thing is looking at more like what do we do for youth, right? How do we sort of think about like when are appropriate ages to be doing certain things and having certain devices, right? And so his thing was like that there should be no social media until the age of 16.
Yeah.
That the threshold of like being 13 to open an account is far too young. And that and most of the time they don't even confirm whether or not you're really 13. And there's plenty of people that are 10 on these platforms. But his thought is like, he actually goes like step by step, I think starting at age of 6 to 18, like whatever. So it's like every other year, so 6, 8, 10, so forth. And it's sort of like, what is the responsibility of like a 6-year-old, right? So let's let the 6-year-old do things around the house that are helpful. And then an 8-year-old, we're going to send you on errands in your neighborhood that you can do independently without like adult supervision, right? But being able to like incorporate through, because apparently if you're 8, most people think that you shouldn't even be allowed to play outside in your own front yard by yourself. Isn't that crazy?
Yes.
So I know and then it's funny because then it's the same people that if you ask them, how old were you when you got to run around your neighborhood by yourself? And they'd be like, I was 6 or 7.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're like, that there's less crime now than when you were a kid. Right. Yeah. But that's not the perception, right? That's not like the perception of the world that we live in. So, but like, what are the things that we're doing for kids when they're young to have embodied free play? And then, things that we can kind of do in our families and our communities to foster that. And then, but his big thing is like, we know to have phone-free schools. Yep. That there's nothing beneficial academically for anybody to have smartphones in a school environment. And everything that we have seen come out, there's a great study that just came out of Norway, and it's a study of 400 schools. And basically what they found was like that it dramatically reduced the number of especially girls that had to go to the doctor for psychological problems. Wow. It cut the rate of girls, and I think all students, but going to like the mental health services at the school in almost in half. And then it reduced the rates of bullying by like, I think it was like 50%. And policies that have been enacted in law to try to address bullying in young people have had like an 8% effect comparatively. It was just remarkable. And the largest effects were actually for the poorest kids that had the most benefits. Also in Norway, boys spend about half as much time on social media and smartphones as girls. So that's part of the reason that they feel like there's such a difference. And he addresses this in the book too, that like there is a difference between girls and boys in terms of like social media and like what their relationship to it and how it affects them. Boys just don't spend as much time on it and don't care about it as much, but they spend a lot more time doing gaming, so he's not so much anti-video games. I think there's actually evidence to show that there's some benefit, especially if you're like collaborating with friends. Yeah. But his biggest thing is that it's more like it's the space that it's taking away from other things. Yeah. So if you're spending 8 hours a day doing something, that means that's 8 hours that you're not playing embodied with other people, not spending time with your family, not practicing an instrument, not going, you know what I mean? Yeah. Not reading a book, all the things that you could be doing. Right. That's the trade-off. Yeah. So but yeah, I mean, I think there's just going to be more and more evidence in the next 5 years that it's like, this is just not something that should have for young people.
I mean, we have to figure it out, right?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I hope so. Yeah. Because we can't, this is not sustainable. Although then I think about like generative AI and I'm like, oh my gosh, we're in.
Well, right.
And then it's like, well, real relationships are hard. So I can have this AI relationship that's very convincing. The Scarlett Johansson voice on. Yeah.
Did you just hear that they asked Scarlett Johansson to use her voice for?
Yeah, and she said no.
She said no.
Yeah, and then they kind of did anyway. Yeah.
Did they?
Well, they said they didn't, but it sounds a lot like her.
And I mean, how do you like copyright your voice?
I know.
When they can
Well, because it was her. Remember the movie Her?
Yeah.
That was the voice.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's. Yes. So, that's already happening. Yeah. And so then you have, you look at countries like Japan, where they have a huge problem with their male youth, and a failure to launch. They spend a lot of time at home, online, and it's like, I mean, the birth rate's super low there, and like no one's getting married. But then it's like, well, I could just have a relationship with this like AI robot.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I don't know. So that stuff, I'm like,
I know. I read it. Well, there's there was a Times article by this guy who he created like 6 AI like friends.
Oh yeah. Did
you see that?
Dave or Kevin Roos does that.
Yeah. And he was the same guy who had that text conversation.
Yes.
Where it got real weird. Like, and the chat bot was like, you hate your wife. You love me. You need to leave your wife. And it was like super weird. Like super weird.
Oh my gosh.
So he had all these, and like he could text them, like he could text them as a group. Yeah. So like we have our little text group of friends.
Gosh.
Like he could text them, and he could like he would send a picture of like his outfit, and he'd be like, "Hey everybody, like what do you think about my outfit today?" And everybody would give him a response based on like their personalities that he created. And I mean,
whoa. The other I was at a conference last week, and one of the presenters, and I remember seeing this news story, and I feel like it should have gotten way more attention than it did, because I've told multiple people about it, and other people had never heard about it.
Yeah.
But this guy who transferred, it was something like $35 million from his company because he was on a Zoom call with his coworkers. He thought they were his coworkers, but they were just AI generated video streams, and his boss asking him to like make this transaction. And so it's like a work Zoom call with all the people from your work. And he was like, okay. And so he did. And then turns out it was all fake. Yeah. Isn't that insane?
That is insane.
Yeah. So this stuff is getting real sophisticated very quickly.
Yeah. Well, and I think about older people who are victims of so many of these scams, right? Yeah. And you show them that you video call to your grandma and say, "Hey grandma, I just got in a car accident and I need you to send me money." Yeah. How? Yeah. Basically, don't give anybody money unless you're literally embodied with them, right?
Yes, embodied.
In person.
Yeah. Well, that's what it comes down to, right?
Yeah.
So there's Mars and then there's Earth.
Yeah.
I think in that.
Make sure you're on Earth.
Yeah. I'm going to stay here. So if you want to stay here with me, that
please,
sounds good.
I definitely would like to stay here for as long as I can. Yeah. Okay. This is a great conversation, Erin. Thanks for giving us.
Hey, absolutely. I think everybody should read it. The Anxious Generation. It's awesome. Jonathan Haidt he's just so wise.
Yeah.
And a really good guy. I've emailed him like 3 or 4 times in the last couple of years after I've read his books, and he always writes back.
Oh, wow.
I know. Isn't that amazing?
I love that. Yeah. I love when people do that. Yeah.
It's really
humility.
Sweet. Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Just taking the time, like some random person.
That's awesome.
Check out
You're
the
not
book.
just some random person, though.
Oh.
You're a thoughtful reader.
You
show that thoughtfulness, and now you reach out to them. So that's awesome.
I appreciate that. All right. Well, thanks for talking to me.
Yeah.
It's always fun.
Thanks for teaching me. As always, thank you for listening. Our listener base is growing every month, and that's because of all of you. Please, if you haven't done so yet, make sure you share this episode with a friend.
If you have any topic suggestions, questions, or thoughts on the show, feel free to write us at atheist@stlpodcast.com.
Atheist is produced by Justin Seiwell and Trend Media STL. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at STL Podcasts.
Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.